Hello everyone, my name is Elliott and I'm a software developer at MergeBase. Today we're going to be talking all about SBOMs. I have with me CEO Oscar Meer. And Oscar, if you want to give a quick introduction of yourself, and then I'll get right into the topic.
Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, my name is Oscar Meer. I'm a co-founder here at MergeBase, and our mission is really to protect the software supply chain. And SBOMs, which is what we're going to talk about today, are a key component of that.
I guess I'll just start with asking you, what is an SBOM? Why are they important?
It's a file format that lists the bill of materials, and bill of materials are kind of a century-old concept. Like it's used in construction, in manufacturing. If you build a house, what are the components that it's built of? But for software, it's a new thing. So software bill of material tells you what components make up an application, and they're very important from a risk management perspective.
So what kind of companies do we see using software bill of materials recently?
Software bill of materials, it's coming up is run through regulation. So there's different regulatory bodies, especially in the US, but also now increasingly in other countries, that are coming up with regulations that essentially require people to use software bill of materials. And federal government in the US is a big proponent of software bill of materials. So FedRAMP, which is a regulation that you have to comply with if you deliver services to the US government, for instance, has required software bill of materials, I think, for over a year. We're seeing recently that the Federal Drug Administration is requiring software bill of materials for the software on medical devices by starting October 1st this year. Right, so these are kind of some of the leading edge kind of practices. We see manufacturing organizations, retailers increasingly use it because they have a big supply chain, and often they also already have a mature supply chain risk management process in place. And so, the fact that software supply chain attacks have increased tenfold over the last 2 years has really triggered a lot of these organizations also to say, well, we need to, expand our supply chain risk management to include software.
You mentioned the term software supply chain, so maybe it's important to talk about the differences in the supply chain and software versus conventional industries. So What makes software so different, and what makes this standard important?
I'll start with the answer first, which is kind of, software components tend to be free because it's open source software. But why is that important? Well, if you look at the traditional risk management frameworks that, for instance, the financial institutions and a lot of other industries are using, it's built on the fact that the guy who's at the top of the food chain, say, let's take an example, let's say General Motors. Like General Motors probably manufacture 20% of the components in their cars themselves. Like 80% will come from suppliers that they have close relationships with, say, for instance, an airbag. So General Motors pays this airbag manufacturing a lot of money, and so they can enforce their risk management standards, their policies, their procedures, their quality criteria. They can enforce that onto the supplier, and through that they can effectively offload a lot of their risk management work and effort onto their suppliers. Not so much in software, because it all starts with the fact that General Motors is paying these guys and gives them a huge amount of leverage. What has happened in software is that you used to have commercial components that people would buy libraries, especially in the Microsoft.NET environment, for example, but that has increasingly been replaced by open source. Like 99% of software components being used are open source. And it's a lot, like 80 to 90% of an application tends to consist nowadays of open source components. And so it's a huge amount of components, but you have no grip, no leverage over the supplier. Like you can't go to them and say, well, we're not going to pay you anymore if you don't do this or don't that. That is not possible. It's free. It doesn't get much better than that, but you also have lost the leverage. So it's almost a reverse kind of, a relationship in terms of who has the power, and the user doesn't have a lot of power. And so that's why there is a lot of issues here. And I think a lot of companies that have a traditional risk management mindset actually are struggling to figure out how to really apply that to open source, because it's not possible.
How to get started using SBOM?
there's a number of open source tools that you could use to start with some bill of material. What we're seeing with a lot of organizations that they are also looking more at this from a contractual perspective, like they go to their suppliers that supply them with applications and say, well, please also provide me a software bill of material. So they might want to look at kind of the standard terms and conditions in their vendor management area, kind of starting to require that. So a lot of organizations have a multi-step process there where they're first saying, well, just give us a software bill of material. Don't necessarily specify exactly what it needs to look like, because a lot of different format people use. But then perhaps next year they might kind of converge more on a specific standard and start and subsequently providing them feedback saying they want to see changes in the application. But from a risk management perspective, I think a lot of organizations are seeing immediate lift. As soon as they basically start requiring a software bill of material from their vendors, you shine a light on what makes up that application, and you effectively everything that you make transparent kind of starts to attract attention, and people start to automatically improve. Like vulnerabilities disappear because people are starting to pay attention. So just kind of even a lightweight approach where you just ask in a friendly fashion for a software bill of material to your vendors will already provide quite a bit of lift in terms of reducing your company's risk.
But it seems like there's a lot of reasons to use SBOMs. So we at MergeBase, we are an SBOM vendor. So, is it difficult procedurally to get started, or is it something that you can do, easily within your organization?
Well, there's really two sides of the SBOM market. In a sense, there's the software vendors that produce SBOM, and then there is the buyers that basically buy a number of different software packages and require SBOMs. So the effort is different for the different sides. So if you're a software vendor, it's very easy, I think, in general, to start producing an SBOM, right? Because you have one or just a few applications, you integrate a tool like MergeBase into your build pipeline, and every time you build an application, you generate an SBOM. It's pretty straightforward. One subtlety is that as a software vendor, you really want to make sure that you have VEX support, right? Because there might be vulnerabilities that are not relevant for your application, and so VEX gives you an ability, and MergeBase has that capability built in to say which vulnerabilities are not impacting the security of the application. Now, the other side is the buyer, right? And so the buyer, I think it's more work, typically because it has to deal with a different level of maturity at their suppliers. Right. So for some suppliers, it will be very easy to provide them with an SBOM, but for others, it might not, or it might provide it in formats that are difficult to digest for the buyer. So I think as a buyer, you tend to have a longer journey to make this effective. But ultimately, this is all about the buyer, because it's their risks that we're trying to reduce.
Just trying to reduce, for sure.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a couple of things, that there's multiple standards of SBOM, and there's also something called VEX. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the different standards, the differences between them, and if there's any that are preferred right now for companies getting started with SBOM.
Yeah. There's a number of different standards. The two dominant ones in the market currently are Cyclone DX, which is supported by OWASP, which is the kind of de facto organization for application security globally. And then the other format is SPDX, which has become an ISO standard. Organizations that actively use SBOMs right now, that go beyond just collecting them, that actively analyze them and work with them, they often tend to use Cyclone DX tools. But organizations that take a longer term view and say, well, we have like a multi-year process to wrestle this problem to the ground and to kind of step by step in a managed fashion get to where we want to be from a risk management perspective, they often favor SPDX because it's the ISO standard, especially outside of the US, right? Because that's where ISO is very dominant.
So the other thing I want to ask about is, what is VEX, and what does it mean to have a VEX-enabled SBOM?
The SBOM lists the components.
Right.
VEX adds additional information to that about what is vulnerable, and then you can also say if a vulnerability doesn't really affect an application, perhaps because there's a compensating control or component is used in such a way that it can't be, even though it's vulnerable, can't be abused. A good example of that would encryption libraries, right? So encryption libraries often have a huge number of encryption algorithms in them, and you might be using, a particular algorithm that is, perfectly fine, but there might be a vulnerability with another algorithm in that library, but you're not using that algorithm.
So it's for use with the internal risk management as you're using it actively.
I hear different things from the vendors and from the buyers. For the vendors, I think it's important to have VEX, right? Because it reduces for them the effort to eliminate vulnerabilities. And there are a lot of these type of scenarios that I just painted where it actually, it doesn't make sense for them to eliminate that vulnerability in that crypto library because they're not using that particular part as an example. But the buyers are often kind of skeptical, and they want to have the kind of do their own analysis.
That's very fair. So we've discussed that there are multiple standards currently, and there's sort of a difference between the short-term and long-term view. Is SBOM something you should wait to adopt until there is the ISO standard is global, or if the Cyclone DX format matures, or is it something that you should just get started with it immediately?
Yeah, I think earlier you can start with it, the better. Kind of it depends on the type of organization you are, like a vendor or a buyer of software, for instance, kind of what kind of journey you want to go through. But earlier you start, the better. You build up more understanding, and effectively a situation where you have two standards is actually not that bad. I mean, there's a lot of areas where look at standards for instance, for APIs, right? There's SOAP and REST. There's a bunch of others. So that didn't stop people from developing APIs. Just having two is actually a pretty good situation. Right? One would be better, but we don't live in an ideal world. So having two is pretty good to work with, and I think both standards are good to work with. Cyclone DX is a little bit more mature. It seems like a little bit tighter in terms of its specifications. So if you want to do a lot of work with it, probably that's what we're seeing. It's being used, but this market will mature pretty quickly, and it probably doesn't matter. If you take the long-term view with standards, you're going with.
So now we've been talking about SBOMs. SBOMs seem to have some sensitive information that could be contained within them. So is it ever problematic to make SBOMs public? Or is it something that you should be publishing, widely? There's
different views on that. I've definitely heard a lot of organizations are cautious with what they publish because they think that somehow if they disclose what libraries their application, they somehow kind of relinquish some IP or they make it easier for attack their software. I'm not so sure about the IP, but that it does, if you provide that information, it does make it easier for attackers. But we would be kidding ourselves if attackers don't have the capability of analyzing these applications themselves already. So I think, the fact that making it public and effectively creating transparency is a much more powerful tool. In my mind, that's my opinion, and not everybody agrees with me, but I think transparency is a much more powerful tool to help reduce the risks than effectively kind of perceived disclosure of secretive information, because it's really not so secret. It's relatively easy probably for adversaries to get that information anyway.
So it's more powerful to manage the risks.
Yeah,
for your potential buyers. Do we expect to see SBOM become mainstream or adopted, across a wide variety of industries, or do you expect that it will continue to be limited to industries where regulations are more important?
Well, I think it's already applied in beyond kind of industries beyond regulation. I think it will play an important part in the B2B markets or business to business, not so much in business to consumer. Like right. I don't think that if a consumer buys a gadget, whatever, they are looking for a software bill of material. So, but if a company purchases an application and that application has a substantial impact on their risk, they're going to be concerned, and they want to have tools to manage that risk, and SBOM provides that. I mean, to go a little bit deeper into that, why did SBOMs actually come about? We didn't talk about that too much, but there is this gap from a risk management perspective where traditionally software vendors would ship their software, and then they would have big, license agreements that would say, well, we're not liable for virtually anything. And then the buyer would get that application, but it would expose them, because there might be vulnerabilities in them, would expose the buyer to a lot of risks. The buyer doesn't have any information on what's in the application, so they have no tools to manage the risk. And so they basically gave up, to start with, and said, well, we can't manage this risk, so we're not going to. But so the situation was that the vendor contractually said, well, we're not interested in manage. The buyer says we can't manage the risk.
Manage the
So
risk, yeah.
so end result is nobody was managing the risk, and that's why we have a tenfold increase in for supply chain attacks over the last 2 years, because this gap is being exploited massively by cyber adversaries, and so that's one of the main reasons that we need SBOM to kind of close that gap. Yeah.
Right. So the trend with closing that gap is due to things like SolarWinds attack a few years ago, which impacted global security essentially. U.S. security, national security interests, which I think maybe has pushed SBOM to the forefront of the mind for a lot of people.
Yeah, just to kind of finish answering your question, I think on regulations, probably 60 or 70%. I think that's what numbers I've seen of kind of in the B2B space, companies are going to want to use SBOMs in some form or shape over the next few years. There's always going to be industries where risk management is not that relevant, not necessarily that important, and so you will not get to 100%. But I think a big chunk of industries beyond kind of the ones that specifically require SBOMs through regulation will also want to use SBOMs to manage their risk.
Oscar, thank you for talking to me today about SBOM. We've learned a lot. And in terms of MergeBase, where can we go to find out more about MergeBase and more about SBOM in the future?
You can just go to our website, mergebase.com, look at some of our blog articles on SBOM. We'll find a lot of information to kind of get going.